faced death not once, but twice. When the world's deadliest weapon fell from the sky, he survived. And when it struck again, he lived to tell the tale. This is the unbelievable true story of the man who endured both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The summer of 1945 was unlike any other. Japan was weary, the Second World War had drained its strength, and rumors of defeat whispered through the narrow alleys of Hiroshima. Yet, to ordinary people, life went on. Children still played in the dusty streets, merchants still opened their shops, and workers still made their way to the Mitsubishi shipyards, one of the city's largest employers. Among those workers was a young man named Yamaguchi Tsutomu, an engineer only 29 years old, whose life until then had been filled with ordinary hopes, work, family, and survival during a time of war. On the morning of August 6, 1945, he awoke early. He was not at home in Nagasaki, where his wife and child lived, but in Hiroshima, sent there for a temporary work assignment. It was supposed to be just another routine day, his final morning in the city before returning home. The sky was a deep, brilliant blue, the air heavy with midsummer heat. Few could have guessed that within moments, that same sky would unleash a horror the world had never seen before. As he walked toward the shipyard, he noticed the stillness of the city. Planes had flown overhead before, reconnaissance, he thought, but this morning seemed oddly quiet. Then, at exactly 8:15 a.m., a white flash split the sky. In less than the time it takes to blink, the air ignited. A roar like the end of the world swallowed the city. Yamaguchi was thrown backward, his ears ringing, his body seared with pain. He had been less than 2 miles from the hypocenter of the blast. The force shattered windows, flattened buildings, and turned thousands into shadows etched into the ground. When he opened his eyes, the world he had known was gone, replaced by flames, ruins, and a sky turned black with smoke. He staggered to his feet, his arms and face burned, his eardrums ruptured, yet somehow, impossibly, he was alive. Around him, people screamed, their voices mixing with the crackle of fire. The city was unrecognizable. He could hardly breathe, the air itself thick with dust and ash. Yamaguchi wandered through the devastation in disbelief. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle. He saw bodies collapsed in the streets, mothers clutching lifeless children, and survivors staggering blindly, their skin hanging in strips from their bodies. He was not a soldier now. He was just a man who had entered hell and walked out still breathing. That night, burned and battered, Yamaguchi somehow found refuge in a half-destroyed air raid shelter. He thought of his wife and child in Nagasaki. He thought of home. And he whispered to himself, through pain and exhaustion, "I must go back." Little did he know, his journey had only just begun. The horror of Hiroshima was not the end of his story, it was only the beginning. The morning after the blast, Yamaguchi staggered out of the ruins of Hiroshima like a ghost. His face and arms were scorched, his body weak from the heat and the shock, but his will to survive burned stronger than the pain. The city was a graveyard. Fires still raged. Survivors searched desperately for water, many collapsing before they could even drink. Yamaguchi's first thought was not of himself but of home. His wife, Hisako, and their infant son were waiting for him in Nagasaki, unaware of what had just happened hundreds of miles away. Every instinct told him he had to get back to them. With no food, little water, and his ears still ringing from the blast, he began the long walk to the train station. Along the way, he passed unimaginable sights, entire families lying in silence, their bodies twisted by fire. Men and women stumbling forward, their skin hanging loose from their arms. Children crying for parents who would never answer. Each step was like walking deeper into a nightmare. When he reached the edge of the city, he saw that the train tracks were somehow still intact. Against all odds, the Japanese railway had managed to organize an evacuation train. Covered in burns and bandages, Yamaguchi boarded, collapsing into a seat, among other survivors who looked less like passengers and more like the living dead. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than the smoke. The train rattled through the countryside, carrying with it the broken remnants of a city that had ceased to exist. As they passed through villages, people looked on in shock, staring at these survivors as though they had crawled out of the ashes of another world. Hours later, the train pulled into Nagasaki. Exhausted, trembling, and still half-deaf, Yamaguchi made his way home. When Hisako opened the door, she gasped at the sight of her husband. His face was swollen, his arms wrapped in makeshift bandages, his eyes hollow from what he had seen. Through cracked lips, he whispered the words, "Hiroshima." Destroyed, Hisako could barely believe him. The idea that an entire city could vanish in an instant was beyond comprehension. But as Yamaguchi described the blinding flash, the thunderous roar, and the sea of fire that followed, a shiver of dread ran through her. Little did she know, only 3 days later, their own city would face the same fate. Despite his burns and trauma, Yamaguchi forced himself to report back to work at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. His body screamed with pain at every movement, but his duty and perhaps a desire for normalcy drove him forward. When he walked into the office, his colleagues stared in shock. His head was wrapped in bandages, his arms blistered, his face swollen and raw. But what stunned them more were the words he spoke. Hiroshima. It no longer exists. One bomb destroyed the entire city. The room fell silent. Managers exchanged uneasy glances, some skeptical, some in disbelief. How could a single bomb wipe out a whole city? Japan had seen years of war, but nothing like this had ever been imagined. One superior frowned and shook his head. "Yamaguchi, you must be mistaken. No weapon could do such a thing." But Yamaguchi insisted. He described the blinding flash, the monstrous fireball, the shockwave that crushed buildings like paper. He told them about the thousands of lifeless bodies, the cries of the wounded, the rivers filled with the dead. Still, many refused to believe him. To them, it sounded like the wild story of a man traumatized by war. His words hung in the air, heavy with dread, but they did not truly sink in. And then, 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, Nagasaki would learn the truth for itself. That morning, as Yamaguchi stood in a meeting with his supervisors, explaining again what he had seen, the world outside their office suddenly turned white. A blinding flash lit up the sky. The building trembled. Glass shattered. And once more, Yamaguchi was thrown to the ground. For the second time in just 3 days, he was caught at the very center of an atomic inferno. The white flash outside the office window was followed by a deafening roar. A second sun had ignited over Nagasaki. In that instant, the air itself seemed to explode. Yamaguchi threw himself to the floor as glass and wooden beams rained down. The building shuddered and collapsed around them. He had felt this horror once before, and now it was happening again. The pressure waves slammed into the office, tearing doors off their hinges, hurling men across the room. A blinding fireball consumed the sky, devouring everything in its path. But once more, against all odds, Yamaguchi lived. The office walls shielded him from the worst of the blast. His wounds reopened, burns tore deeper, and yet his body clung to life. Staggering through the rubble, his ears ringing, he stepped outside into a nightmare almost identical to Hiroshima. The streets were reduced to smoking ruins. Fires raged across the hills. Bodies lay twisted in silence. Survivors wandered, their skin hanging ribbons, calling out for water. And Yamaguchi, barely able to stand, his face burned, his clothes in tatters, realized the unthinkable truth. He had just survived the second atomic bombing in history. 2 cities destroyed. 2 hells endured. And 1 man lived to tell the tale. Through the smoke and ruins of Nagasaki, Yamaguchi dragged himself home. His burns stung with every step, his head spun, but one thought burned brighter than the fires around him: his family. When he reached the neighborhood, his heart froze, everything was flattened, homes reduced to ashes. He stumbled over debris, calling out for his wife and daughter. For a moment, terror gripped him. Had the bomb taken them too? Then, through the haze, he saw them, his wife and little girl, alive. By sheer chance, his wife had left the house earlier that morning to fetch bandages for Yamaguchi's burns from Hiroshima. That errand saved their lives, for the walls of their home had been obliterated. His daughter, just a child, clung to her mother, frightened but unharmed. Yamaguchi collapsed in relief, tears mixing with ash on his face. Twice death had reached for him, and twice he had escaped. But more miraculous still, his family had survived the unimaginable. As the days passed, Nagasaki became a vision of hell. Thousands of wounded filled the streets, their skin burned, their voices weak. The stench of smoke and death lingered in the air. Food and water were scarce. Hospitals overflowed with the dying, and radiation sickness began to spread. But even as his body screamed in pain, Yamaguchi clung to hope. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a witness to humanity's darkest moment. And he knew his story had to live on. In the weeks after Nagasaki, Yamaguchi lay in bed, his body wrapped in bandages, fevered from burns and radiation. Many around him died, yet somehow he endured. As months turned into years, Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes. Yamaguchi returned to work, raising his daughter and quietly carrying the weight of memories no one could imagine. But the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never left him. His skin bore the scars, and his soul carried the screams of those who hadn't survived. For decades, Yamaguchi remained silent. Then, in his later years, he began to speak to students, to reporters, to the world about the horrors of nuclear war. He said, "The only people who should ever build nuclear weapons are those willing to sacrifice their own children to the bomb." In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized Tsutomu Yamaguchi as the only man confirmed to have survived both atomic bombings. The world called him Niyu Hibakusha, the double survivor. He lived to the age of 93, passing away in 2010. His story became more than survival. It was a warning, a plea, a living reminder of what humanity must never repeat. Yamaguchi's life is proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, courage and endurance can shine brighter than the fire of any bomb.
Thanks you for watch. Every old story holds a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for watch and listen more old times, real stories, and don't forget,